It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks, episode 52. And joining me, as per usual, is Hong Kong Jack. How are you, mate?
I'm excellent. We're in the middle of Diwali here. In fact, it's Diwali all around the world.
Yes, it is. It's not just a specific to Hong Kong thing.
No, but I live in it's a very Chinese city, Hong Kong, but I live in a very multicultural area of it. Within 3 blocks, we have Hong Kong's Catholic Cathedral, Hong Kong's oldest mosque, and Hong Kong's oldest synagogue, and there are no shortage of Hindus around as well. So the streets have been full of people who are unaccustomed to wearing the full Indian kit. You normally see them in Western gear, but they've had the saris and
safari suits. It's a kind of a safari suit.
But you'd have almost thought Justin Trudeau was back in town. There've been so many people dressing up as Indians.
There you go. Well, lots of public holidays coming your way. Perhaps not with Diwali, but there'll be plenty coming your way.
Yeah, we do celebrate every kind of holiday here, though, I've got to tell you.
That's the way to go. Now, look, we did promise our listeners that we were going to have a bit of an expanded discussion about the Brum culling, which is causing a lot of consternation around the country. And this is based on a Senate inquiry that's called on the New South Wales government to use aerial, that's helicopter shooting, to cull the growing number of feral horses, damaging the environment in the Australian Alps. This has been met with a fair amount of cynicism. The report was backed by Labor, Greens and independent senators, and it also recommended the Albanese government develop a national plan to limit the impact of 25,000 feral horses in the high country and boost funding to states and territories to improve alpine environment protection. Jack, the first thing we've got to say is that a lot of the sort of freedom advocates, the freedom movement, cut their teeth in this activism around the Brumbies, and they stick to this kind of poetic nonsense that these horses have been here for 100, 150 years, when that's clearly not the case. We've got some data here that says the population of the horses in the alpine country had grown by 4,000 over 2 years. That's a lot of breeding, but I'd suggest to you that's more than breeding. That's horses being dumped there.
Yeah, it's very hard to know the answer to that, but it could be, yeah.
This is the word, that a number of sort of thoroughbred racehorses have been elbowed out of the horse float somewhere around Kosciuszko's, and I suppose they would be the lucky ones in many cases. But if you've got 25,000 and the population is growing by 4,000 over 2 years, that would indicate to me that's more than mating. So what's the problem here, Jack? Why is this so controversial?
The Bambi effect, isn't it? Horses look cute. People don't want to manage their numbers, which means killing them. We had the same view of sharks and crocodiles. It's just terrible to kill things, and that's just wrong. I mean,
it was actually David Pocock who instigated the inquiry, the independent senator for the and they've got the support of the Greens. We are talking about the extinction of several Indigenous animals in Kosciuszko, animals that are on the brink anyway, because horses, funnily enough, aren't Indigenous to this country, and they tend to make a mess of the environment, as do feral cats, as do pigs, as do goats.
Buffaloes in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, we've got all sorts of problems there. So when we talk about this, when you talk about it in plain speaking ways, this seems to be a regrettable but understandable response.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a farm boy about any of these things, whether it's crocodiles, sharks, feral horses, feral cats or whatever. I reckon you've killed enough of them when they're no longer causing a problem.
Yeah, and it's true. Probably the worst animal to be introduced into the Australian environment is the cat. Cane toads wouldn't be far away. And what they do is absolutely wreck biodiversity. They can do that through, and rabbits would be on the list there too, Jack.
Yeah, rabbits are tastier though.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of them. Yeah, a bit of rabbit saddle is okay, but I have spent in my younger days dispatched quite a few bunnies and got up to central New South Wales. Well, I'm just trying to think where we were. A place called Roto near Hay, and we dispatched quite a few pigs there, Jack. After I'd seen a razorback that the farmer had taken as a squealer, and it was time to turn him into a baconer, and he put a high-powered 22 round in between his eyes, and then he jumped over the fence and jumped into the enclosure and was halfway through cutting its throat, and it jumped up, got up to its feet again, and was looking for a fight. So by this stage we're on the bad side of the fence, so we all leapt back over. And then for the very first time, I had to go out and blast a few with a 30-30, and I was a little bit worried because I wasn't all that good a shot, Jack. But
I missed the Victoria market because back in the 80s, I could pop down there on a Saturday morning and get a pair of rabbits, skinned and clean, for $4. And now the only rabbits in Hong Kong I can buy are these cosseted farm animals from France. I think they live in the Four Seasons. They cost so much when they get here.
Aren't they enormous, though? Those
They
ones?
are big, yeah.
They are a big rabbit.
Nowhere near as gamey and as tasty as a good old Aussie rabbit shot in the back paddock. You know.
Shot in the back paddock. That's the best way to shoot them, Jack, in the back paddock. All right, we've got some immigration issues now, Jack, that I'd like you to turn to. Basically, the High Court, the Commonwealth of Australia, that is the government, lost a landmark case which overturned the 2004 Al-Khatib decision, which authorised indefinite detention, even in circumstances where it was impossible to deport a non-citizen. So that's been overturned, Jack, and that's meant the release, more or less immediate release, of a number of refugee applicants who have been held in custody over various offences that they've committed, some quite serious, that involve sexual assaults and what have you. And now the government is going to have to deal with that. It's going to have to deal with it by legislative instrument, isn't it, first?
Yes, but it can't do that immediately because the High Court handed down, fairly unusual for the High Court to do this, they handed down the decision immediately but with no written reasons. And until the government gets the written reasons, they really can't frame any legislation to either counter it or work around it. That may not be possible anyway. I'd say they're unlikely to get those written reasons this year. So it will take some time before any legislative fix, if indeed a legislative fix would work, can be made.
I noticed the opposition leader and other members of the opposition trying to make merry on this as if it was the government's fault, but it's the government's problem, isn't it?
Well, it's the government's problem now, and the government argued against the High Court decision. They wanted to keep these people in detention. That's the current government wanted them to keep them in detention. These are very difficult cases. The fellow who brought the action in the High Court is a Rohingya man who is a convicted child sex abuser, but there's no prospect of getting him back to Myanmar, Burma.
Of course not.
And the probability is that no other country would consider resettling him. And not all of the 92 cases are going to be convicted sex offender. Another chap, I think, is a Malaysian who's accused of murdering and then blowing up a woman in Malaysia. And he can't be deported because he would be executed if he's returned to Malaysia, and the Australian government won't deport people who face possibility of execution.
Right.
So some of these cases at the top end, if you like, are
they're
difficult.
absolute top end. You've got a number of others who have recorded driving offences. There was a story, Paul Garvey report in the Australian Today as we record this on the 14th of November 2023. There was a Somalian fellow who had committed a number of driving offences. They were all enmeshed at which is the right term, razor ribbon around a hotel, but that's where a lot of these people are currently held.
And some of them will be what we used to refer to as identity cases. That is, people who make an application for asylum, for a protection visa, and say, look, I stowed away on a ship and I got here that way, and this is what my identity is, but there's no way of checking that.
Right.
And some of those cases are pretty poor. Generally speaking, people who are in that situation have been before a tribunal and a judge multiple times and still no one's believed them. So that's a difficulty. Have the government got some of this wrong? The opposition does have one small point, and that is it would have been better if the government had been a little bit more transparent about what these cases involved. If they'd said the reason we opposed the High Court decision or argued against the High Court decision is because there are a range of cases from the most serious through to and the less serious, and they are all kind of difficult cases.
Yes.
And we're not going to hide from that. But they did hide from it a bit, and that's a mistake.
I noticed that Simon Birmingham for the Liberals was arguing for the use of terrorist laws and control orders therein, applying those control orders to some of these individuals. Jake, is that reasonable?
Well,
is it lawful?
The only way you'd ever do something like that, and indeed the only way to deal with these 92 cases really is on a case-by-case basis. You look at it and say, this is the degree of difficulty we've got. How do we get around that?
But what I'm asking is, without legislative change in this period, probably for going for some months, is the implementation of control orders, is that lawful?
I don't think so, but there will be a lot of follow-up work, shall we put it, from the various police forces involved to keep an eye on people.
Well, Birmingham was talking about putting electronic bracelets on people and those sorts of things.
I don't think that's a solution that's available.
Yeah. So
not at the moment.
The opposition is
making... And there may
making
never be a solution. I mean, it's one thing to wait for the High Court reasons, but that might not put you in a situation where you can legislate to change this. We just might be stuck with it.
Right, yes. And of course the opposition is, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, is making merry with all of this stuff by suggesting things that are not lawful, that are not that might resonate with voters, but are not something that the government can actually do.
Yeah, but the way for the government to counter that was not to wait till Ben Fordham on the radio in Sydney started talking about the bloke who murdered a woman who was alleged to have murdered a woman in Malaysia, but to come out on the front foot and say, these cases are difficult. Some of them are like this. Boom,
Yes, I see what you mean. When was that? When was the High Court finding handed down?
Oh, a couple of days ago, I think.
Yeah, it's only a couple of days ago. So, yes. Oh, well, I guess there's an issue there for the government to address in terms of communications. Look, I have been looking at Birmingham and Dutton and saying, well, you're really making merry here on just playing some pretty awful politics and basically insinuating that the government has failed. This is a subject of a High Court finding. The government will need to make legislative changes. They may indeed involve control orders and electronic bracelets going forward, but they can't do it at the moment. And I guess your point too, that the government has allowed the opposition to get on the front foot, I suppose.
They did. The government made a political error, I think, in the way they approached it. I think there's no guarantee that legislation would work. I don't think it will be found to be constitutional. My gut feel is that,
Right.
that the things that people think that they can do now just won't work.
So,
it's always hard to predict what a High Court's going to do,
right.
But I just don't think it will work.
So technically, we would have to get used to the fact that people coming here who have committed serious offences, and I note that the 90-odd applicants, many of them are not serious offenders, driving offences and things like that. But at the pointier end, we may have to get used to the fact that people convicted of very serious crimes, these cannot be sent back.
Yeah, worse than that, the ones who've done their time here, who committed the offences here, and they're like everybody else who's done their time. I suppose we're just going to have to live with the fact that they're back out in the community. But in the case, say, something a bit like the Malaysian case where the guy has committed the crime, alleged to have committed the crime in Malaysia, can't be sent back, hasn't actually done his time, right? And he might be in the community.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
But some of the cases, most immigration stuff sails through pretty smoothly and fits within the parameters. Every now and again, you get stuff that operates on the edge, and they're very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, 92 people. It's not something that this country it's not something that we can't absorb, is what I'm saying. 92 people. And there are some particular problems amongst that group. And yes, I think the opposition's making a bit of merry out of this, like Peter Dutton with the whales, Jack. But we won't get into that today. That's not on our list of discussions today. Yeah. Peter Dutton's become a whale lover, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. And that takes us to polling. And interesting stuff here. I did have a look at William Bowe's poll budget site, which has Labor, his two-party preferred equations, leave it at 57-43, a massive two-party preferred difference now between the government and the opposition. And all while we're hearing all these sort of tales of woe around the government. And I think there are some issues that the government needs to address, particularly at the pointy end. But overall, they are leading in polling by a huge margin compared to the one they won by.
Yeah, this is pretty much what I expected it to be. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, has suffered a small personal hit, and I think that's probably a hit from the referendum, amongst other things.
Yes.
But as I thought would happen, the Labor Party itself, the Labor government itself, hasn't suffered any damage from the referendum much at all.
Yeah, so Anthony Albanese's personal ratings, very good plus good performance rating, has been down 5 to 39 with poor plus very poor up 3 to 46. Peter Dutton is respectively at 35, a very good performance rating, and 40 on a negative or very negative rating there. Peter Dutton records his best results yet, and they're not great. They're still in the negative, but they're his best results that he's obtained. And added to this, well, Albanese leads 40 to 27 on preferred Prime Minister. I'm not a big fan of that particular polling data, and he's in from 47-25, so there's a marginal change there. But that's really just preferred Prime Minister is a sort of nonsense thing, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, it's not something I pay much attention to. Yeah.
The only time I'd ever pay attention to it is if you had an opposition leader who was profoundly and over an enduring period ahead of the sitting Prime Minister. That's the only time I think you can take that seriously.
And that normally shows up in the two-party preferred figure anyway. If you remember back to when Kevin Rudd was elected Labor leader, he got, I think, about a 5-point bounce in the two-party preferred.
Yeah, and never
looked back. And there was nothing that Howard could do to shift it.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking of that instance too, that he led, I think it was around December of 2006, he led as preferred Prime Minister. Yeah. And was never, and as you say, Howard never got close to him after that. There is one thing I want to talk to you about. That there was the Age Herald survey has said that there is a sort of growing economic pessimism around the place, with between 41 to 46 expecting economic conditions to worsen over various timeframes from a month to a year. And that, I think, should be the area that the government should be concerned about, Jack, because when we talk about voting, what motivates voters, Jack, it's the economy first, second, third, and fourth, fifth, and the rest, basically. There always are a myriad issues, but the economy, it's the economy, stupid, always stands.
Even more importantly than that, once the voters have decided that you're handling the economy badly, that's a very hard metric to shift at all.
Yeah, that's right. And we do have...
And we're not there yet, but that's what the government's got to be cautious about, I would think.
Yeah, that's right. We're not there yet, but that is something that should cause them it should cause them to basically start communicating a little bit better. I think there are some communication issues there. We haven't heard much from the Treasurer for a while. Anthony Albanese has been portrayed as, what do they call him, just because he's travelling? I forget what they call
Airbus elbow.
Yeah, which is something that's cooked up in the Liberal Party room or somewhere thereabouts. I don't have a problem with Prime Ministers travelling, and they should be in the South Pacific. The South Pacific was largely ignored by previous administrations, and in the other instance, well, Albanese was in China and doing pretty good work there. I know there's just an over-analysis, but our relationship with China is much, much stronger than it used to be, and we can't ignore the fact that China is our major trading partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Take it back into the deep, dark past now, listeners, to 1976. In fact, the winter of 1976. It was the winter. It was the winter for a lot of Labor people, wasn't it, Jack? After the 75 smashing and dismissal, and Malcolm Fraser turned up to open the Conditional Centre, a new education. He was Prime Minister, of course, Malcolm, and it was a new education facility for special needs children at Monash University in Melbourne. And he'd been, since his election in December of 1975, he had protests all over the place. But this one is staying with us because there's a documentary being made about this. Fraser turned up, it must be said, in 1976. Well, there was no really, there was an ACT police force, but there was not the Australian Federal Police Force as we know it today. So there were no one really in protective services, or a very small group of protective services whose job it is to look after prominent political leaders. And so they turned up at Monash, which, Jack, you'll help me out there, probably the most activist university at the time.
Yeah, Lot's wife, I think it was called. The Monash University newspaper, student newspaper, was Maoist, really.
Red hot, with the emphasis on the red. And so Malcolm's turned up there, and there appears not to be a lot of communication with Victoria Police. That's the point I was trying to make. Without the AFP and without protective services, Fraser would have relied on state police around the country to provide security services for him. And this documentary tells how it all went horribly wrong. The documentary is called How to Capture a Prime Minister, and he's been working on it for a very long time. And okay, so they basically got caught. Fraser and his officials were caught in the building with people hammering on the doors, Jack.
Yeah, at the Alexandra Theatre, I think. Alexandra Hall, just a small theatre as you head towards the main buildings at Monash. This was really an accident more than anything deliberate.
It was a bit. Yeah, radical students saw an opportunity and they turned up in pretty big numbers at Monash, and Fraser was forced to leave mid-speech and clamber into the Alexandra Hall. And the protest is not planned to imprison him there, but he was essentially held hostage for a fair amount of time. And then
over an hour, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, about an hour. Can you imagine the outrage if it happened today, Jack? And some thought Fraser escaped through a window, which would have to be a big window, but a scrum of police eventually rescued him from the building. And it was shocking and scandalous. I remember the footage or the newspaper reports of that time. I was just a 14-year-old boy at the time, but paint was thrown all over the cars, and there was a hell of a lot of jostling, and I think some police got injured as well. And it's the sort of stuff that would cause howls of outrage today, Jack.
In those days, there was a problem. I don't think the Victoria Police were actually allowed onto the university except in very few circumstances.
We used to glory in this, Jack, when we were at La Trobe, and we used to pop over to Monash on a fairly regular basis too. And the idea that we could commit a few state offences, not really, but there was no way that police could enter a university at that time. It was almost like an embassy, that police could not enter that without the express permission of the Vice-Chancellor, and the Vice-Chancellor and those Vice-Chancellors in those days were not likely to give it.
Yeah, there are a couple of exceptions to that, but pretty much that's the case. Yes, yeah, that was the case.
I just
So you could safely fire up a blunt, for instance, without.
that's where I was going, Jack. That's where I was going, Jack. We used to go to Monash and fire up there, and then we'd get back to Latrobe and fire up again. And once we were off the road, we felt pretty comfortable about everything. I'll just read an extract from a very good friend of ours, one of the great police officers of the Victoria Police Force, the great Brian Harding, who was a chief superintendent, a former secretary of the Police Association, and one of the very best coppers you'd ever want to have on your force. And he relates this in his memoirs, that story. He said he basically starts off by saying the police relationship with Monash had improved vastly since the first visit to Monash by Prime Minister Fraser in 1976. On that occasion, Victoria Police were outside the grounds of the university waiting to be summoned if wanted. The hectic escape of Fraser, and that is not to put the issue too melodramatically, Brian says, was more accidental than planned. A breakdown in communications left the rescue of Fraser to a lone police officer in an unmarked car. He hustled the Prime Minister out of the besieged Alexander Theatre into the car, not through a window, sadly, Jack, and just escaped the threatening mob. This narrow escape was witnessed by Acting Dean of Education Professor Ron Taft, who shared the stage with Fraser. Professor Taft, some years later, summed up the status of police at Monash in 1976. And this is a quote from Professor Ron Taft. For a policeman from outside to come onto campus would be like entering an embassy.
Yep.
That's the way it was in those days. Nowadays, I don't think there are any impediments, are there?
I haven't followed that, but I suspect not.
Yeah. And it's just an interesting tale. And a Prime Minister banged up in a hall with a mob outside calling for his head. If it happened today, Jack, wow. They'd be held to
But you were right at the beginning of this to say that there just wasn't the security around our politicians that we expect today. That just didn't exist at all. I mean, there was, the Prime Minister would have had a close personal protection person with them, maybe two, but that's it. There's no one setting up.
It. Now there's an army. Now there's a small army of protectors there from Commonwealth Protective Services, which is a branch of the AFP, a secret service, if you like. On to more simple, practical things that a government can do to get things very wrong. And this is the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland. And it's been reported that gambling executives hosted her at a lavish lunch on her birthday. Happy birthday, Michelle. In the private dining room of one of Melbourne's best restaurants. Responsible Wagering Australia, which represents Sportsbet, Ladbrokes and Bet365, paid for the November 16 lunch at Society Restaurant. I presume that's last year, Jack, because it's November 14 now.
Yeah, it was last year, yeah.
Last year. So happy birthday for last year, Michelle.
I'm guessing this just came to light.
This has just been dug up. Yeah, that's right. The lunch was labelled a policy briefing with Ms. Rowland, who has a key role in gaming policy, and was teed up by Labor's corporate fundraising arm known as the Federal Labor Business Forum. According to sources, membership of the forum costs up to $110,000 per year. Anyway, Jeffrey Watson, former prosecutor with the New South Wales ICAC, said the point about all of this is for too long we've permitted a system under which governments, it's always the government of the day, have been able to fundraise off the back of controlling power. He goes on to say, it seems to be selling government knowledge to a select few. It seems to be a system under which unless the people paying the money are fools, they're gaining access to information or influence in return for a donation or the cost of a dinner. Does that sound right to you? He says. To me, it's sickening. It's a bad look, isn't it, Jack? Particularly given we've got the gaming folk there.
Well, I guess it does look embarrassing for Michelle Rowland. I've actually been to quite a few of these functions.
Of course you have, Jack. Of course you have.
And
good to be good food and drink.
Yeah, well, and I'm not certainly still not opposed, but certainly in those days I wasn't opposed to a good lunch. If there was one, and I never had to pay for myself to go to it.
Then we get into murky territory there.
Yeah. I don't agree with him. His characterisation of what happens at these lunches. Yes, you do get access. You get to have a little word in the ear of a minister, perhaps, and you find out some information that maybe won't be available for another hour or two. But that's about all you get. People don't go along because they think they're going to change the government's mind so much, or they might think that a little bit. People go along because they want to be close to power. It's a bit like the same reason why well-paid executives will pay almost any amount of money to go into the change rooms after a sports ground. They want to feel like they're part of it.
Want to rub shoulders with the powerful.
Yeah,
I'd also
they want to rub
add,
shoulders
Jack,
with the powerful. So
that Michelle Rowland, her role in gaming as communications minister is pretty small. It relates to how we would advertise gaming. So that's perhaps a little bit more excessive than that. That falls into her ballywork. But into the sort of nuts and bolts of gaming itself, she doesn't play a huge role, must be said. That really comes down to the state minister.
Can I just give you an example of how it works at these things? It was before the 2007, before the Rudd-Gillard government was elected. A very good Italian restaurant in Paddington. I think 15 or 20 people there, mostly from the banking industry. And
Machiavelli's?
No, around the corner. And the candidate to be Deputy Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, was there, and a couple other people who were organising it, and I was invited along. And all the banking executives, they were just like sports fans. They just wanted to know how the election campaign was going. Did they think they could win? Who was going to end up where? How it was going to look? How the government was going to look? That's exactly what you get for that. That's what you pay your money for, and that's what you get. And the food was excellent, by the way, and the wine was even better.
Well, we have, of course, elected politicians, Jack, and as we've covered in this show and many others that we've put together, they are prone to make mistakes. But actors and rock stars, Jack, never will. They will cut to the heart of the matter. No one can do it better than they. And we saw this with Kate Blanchett last week, who gave Australia a thorough bake over its treatment of refugees, Jack. Did you see this?
She's an open borders person, which you can afford to be if you're as rich as Kate Blanchett. That very fine philosopher, Homer Simpson, said, actors, there's nothing they don't know.
Can't do. I think it was rock stars, but they're interchangeable in this case, yeah. Rock stars, is there anything they can't do, is the exact quote. She called for international refugee law to be upheld, notably the 1951 Geneva Convention, as this, and I'm quoting now from Kate, was not only still relevant but foundational to our common humanity. It was a sort of lovely speech in many ways, but it doesn't. I mean, I used to be an open borders person. I mean, I was until probably around about when I changed. That was probably around about 2010, when we basically had the number of people coming into the country by boat at this stage was on an annual run. So basically over a 2-month period was getting up to about 50,000 people per annum. And that's when I started thinking, gee whiz, the government's actually lost control of immigration here. And that's why I started changing my mind a good deal about that. Being an open borders being an open borders supporter means you've got a clear conscience. But in the way the rubber hits the road in geopolitics and Australian domestic politics, is these things are far more complex than that.
No, and normal people won't vote for you if you're an open borders person.
That's true enough too. So, but thank you, Kate, for your wonderful contribution. And yes, we are all terrible people.
But she's a fine actor.
Yeah, not a fan. Anyway, Elbow we've just talked about. Airbus Elbow, isn't that tedious? Come on, guys, you can do better. Elbow was with the South Pacific Forum last week, and as part of that visit, Australia will now offer permanent residency to Tuvalu's population of 11,200 under a world first resettlement agreement for climate refugees displaced by global warming as part of a far-reaching treaty with the tiny Pacific nation. Under the deal, Australia will offer Tuvalu a security guarantee driving giving Canberra the right to veto any attempts by other countries to strike a security agreement with the island state. Talk about that in a minute. And nullifying the risk of another Solomon Islands-style pact with Beijing that sent shockwaves through the Pacific. The Prime Minister unveiling the treaty with Tuvaluan counterpart Kosea Natano on the sidelines of the Pacific Islands Forum in the Cook Islands on Friday described as the most significant agreement between Australia and a Pacific Island nation ever. This is a groundbreaking agreement, and the Australia-Tuvalu Union will be regarded as a significant day in which Australia acknowledged that we are part of the Pacific family. Jack, that also will allow a number of people to come directly from Tuvalu who basically will be misplaced otherwise. So it seems to be a fairly sensible agreement, Jack, and with some good strategic purpose around there. I don't think we fully understand, well, perhaps we're starting to get a proper understanding of the extent of China's influence in the South Pacific. There was a document released last week which showed the level of aid, and PNG getting more aid than anyone in the South Pacific. A good friend of mine, currently a regular traveller to Vanuatu, and it's part of our drive to build Joe a house, who was a Vanuatuan there. And he notices the full extent of Chinese money throughout the South Pacific. Don't expect you to comment too much, Jack, but this is a pretty good deal, isn't it? This is good.
Look, it's not bad. It's 11,000 people. I was just reading it, and I thought
that's the maximum, by the way.
Yeah, that's the maximum. If you're Prime Minister of a country of 11,000 people, do you think you're as important as the Chief Minister of the ACT? I mean, they're both little. It's like being on the mayor of a local council.
There's a good 400-odd thousand, nearly 500,000 people in the ACT, Jack. I mean, I know that the trouble is you can't drive your car fast in the ACT. That's what you can't do. You can do whatever else you like, but just don't drive your car, or don't chop down a tree. That's the other thing, really bad. That's the worst thing you can do, is chop down a tree. But if you want to get on the ice, knock yourself out. I know the Australians have been leading pretty hard on that. I'm actually a bit of an advocate for drug law reform. So comparing the potential penalties for minor league possession to a speeding fine is a bit silly in my view. But anyway, how do you feel about it, Jack? What do you think about drug law reform?
Look, I think these things are tricky. You've got to try and look at the results you're going to get from them.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just saying, let's just decriminalise everything and that will make it go away. Having said, make the problem of addiction and make the problem of crime related to drug use go away. And it's just not quite as simple as that.
No, it's not. I'm not in favour of banging people up in jail for most things, especially not for drug use, but they are tricky. And look, I support the idea of having the injecting room in King's Cross, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to make jokes about it being okay to fill your arm up, but you can't light up a Benson hedge.
You cannot have a durry in the injecting room, which seems to be killing the buzz a little bit. Yeah, it is very difficult, very complex for societies to grab hold of. I'll just direct our listeners there's good data sets coming from Portugal, which were probably the first country to decriminalise and direct people who were pulled up for possession, direct them through to health departments. British Columbia has just done so because their courts were just clogged, their prisons were full, and they had to find another way. The Portuguese have now a good 20 plus years of data. Most of it is pretty good. Most of it is pointing to a benefit, including the raising of the age in which individuals, obviously teenagers, have their first interaction with drugs. That's actually gone up in a decriminalised environment. However, once you look at that data and you say, well, Portugal's done very well. They were motivated by very high rates of HIV. I think they were the second biggest in Europe. And obviously that came from needle sharing and what have you. But their data's actually pretty good. But if you thought to take that same approach and apply it to Australia, I think you'd have all sorts of difficulties. I mean, not political difficulties, you'd have those anyway. But yeah, just transporting something from a relatively small nation to an enormous one like ours is just perhaps not the right way to write up policy.
You need to have some practical people around you when you're making these decisions, so that when you say, if we do this, what's going to happen? And you're going to need the sort of hard-nosed old coppers, etc., who are going to know what the unforeseen consequences are.
True. And every retired copper I've ever spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot, Jack, one of their regrets of their careers will be they just spent too much time on this stuff. They spent too much time on marijuana pinches and things like that.
Yeah.
All right, moving overseas now, Jack, and to the United States. Well, there's a couple of things have happened there. We're looking at some presidential polling first. Jack, a complete reverse of that. There was the state of Virginia had their elections, not their gubernatorial election, but their congressional elections for the state, and there was a big swing to the Democrats there, Jack.
There was. There were also, I think, 6 votes of various kinds on the abortion questions, on restrictions on abortion.
That's right.
And the pro-choice won all of those, and the Democrats went very well in some what we call down the ballot elections. Now, that it's certainly possible to be in a strong position in a presidential campaign and the down the ballots and the gubernatorial elections go badly. The Democrats lost a hell of a lot of state governorships and state houses while Obama won 2 consecutive presidential elections. So there's a bit like Australia, there's sometimes quite a disconnect between those two things. But the abortion issue is a thorny one for the Republicans because the track that they're on at the moment just doesn't have anything like majority support.
Okay. All right, let's look at some polling, and it's fairly consistent in swing states. This is the Siena poll. This is the Bloomberg poll taken in the wake of the Siena poll published in the New York Times. And in Georgia, Trump leads by 7, Arizona by 4, Pennsylvania, Trump leads by 3, Nevada, Trump by 3, Wisconsin, Trump by 1, North Carolina, which Trump held in 2020, he's +9, Michigan 43 apiece. Only a bit of vaguely good news there for Biden.
Those figures would be 300 plus electoral college votes.
Oh yeah, these are essentially, with the exception of North Carolina, these are the states that Biden took off Trump.
One of my favourite wits on Twitter, a guy called Kyle Smith, who writes for one of your sister newspapers, the Wall Street Journal. I think he's a theatre critic there, but he has a similar view to the Trump indictments to I do. His comment was, Trump's about 6 indictments away from a lead in California.
I saw something very interesting. I'll come out and make a big statement, and I actually think Trump won't survive, and it's not so much the indictments. I think political pondering of voters is going to do him over. And the indictments won't help, particularly if he's found guilty. But overall, I see Trump making more and more outlandish statements. I think when we get to, and the point I was going to make earlier was that when we get to abortion law reform in the United States after Roe v. Wade got knocked over, what we're seeing is that there is a dedicated response from the progressive or Democrat side that brings a lot of people out to vote. And this is what we've found. Basically, this is what we've found with Trump gets people out to vote against him in big numbers. This is what we found in 2020. This is what we found in the 2022 midterms. So I think politically his fortunes will start to diminish. But we'll see. We're still dealing, must be said, Jack, we're still dealing with basically name recognition polling. You know.
Yeah, it's a week short of a year away. The abortion thing's really interesting with Trump because he's the one Republican who is sticking with what the people want with abortion. Ron DeSantis, is very critical of Trump because Trump says he would sit down with both sides and I'd negotiate something. We'll end up with peace on that issue for the first time in 20 years. Trump warned Republicans that the party would lose voters by advancing abortion restrictions without exceptions for cases of rape, incest, etc. Other than certain parts of the country, you're not going to win on this issue. He's the sole Republican who's arguing for the middle ground in this.
Yeah, but I can show you a quote from him from a year ago when Roe v. Wade got knocked over when he was claiming credit for it.
Yeah, he was claiming credit for getting rid of Roe v. Wade, and there's a lot of lawyers who are pro-choice who would agree with him about Roe. Almost no one says Roe v. Wade was good law. Haven't heard a decent lawyer say that ever.
But that's not the point. But what I'm saying is that you might have picked it up. There's a tiny weeny little credibility issue around Donald Trump, isn't there? I mean, when he talks about, we can talk about his failed policies and what he was going to do when he was in government. This was a man who was going to create universal health care in the United States. Never ever happened. In fact, the only thing he ever did was launch tax cuts. The only thing he ever real of substance that he was able to get through Congress was that. And so when we get to whatever Trump says now, you just got to look at this from a point of view of this is a man whose really only purpose is to be re-elected and to with a re-election strategy or a policy rollout of revenge. It's extremely dangerous. I just think
don't underestimate him. Don't underestimate him because he's capable of seeing issues, some issues that other people don't, that the political class don't. He won in 2016 largely on the back of that. He was the only person who said that illegal immigration to the United States was a problem. Nobody else on either side of politics agreed with that, and he won. And he's the sort of person now who can come out. He's the only person on either side who can come out and say, this is where we should end up with on abortion.
I remember a bit of vox popping going on after his defeat, a defeat that he doesn't accept, by the way, in 2020. And people were saying, well, when did you stop voting? Well, when did you stop supporting Trump? And they said that this was in the Midwest where elections are fought and won. And these people said, well, it was when he lost the 800-odd children. They realised, Americans have a more profound connection with their immigrant backgrounds than Australians do. I would hazard a guess at that. And that is that they know their own stories. They know their great-granddad or granddad came to the United States often with not very much money. They know their immigration stories. So they actually look at this perhaps more fairly than Australians might. And when they saw 800 kids disconnected from their families and the government being unable to reconnect them, that was when a lot of them dropped off Trump. And that was within probably 3 months of him being sworn in and less.
Americans, like Australian, are an immigration success story. And in both countries, the clear majority view in both countries is legal immigration, go through the system, yes. Come across the border, arrive on a boat from Indonesia, no.
Don't lose 800 kids.
Yeah, I agree. No one wants to lose 800 kids, but this is still terribly unpopular in the United States.
I really just don't think he's got a great deal to offer. And I see in his sort of creeping rallying cries, obvious mistakes, the sorts of things that he routinely points a finger at Biden as suggesting that Biden's cognitive abilities are lacking. Trump thought he'd beaten Barack Obama in a rally recently. He thought he'd beaten Barack Obama in 2016. He thought when giving evidence under oath in New York, he thought he was president in 2021. Well, he was, but that all ended on January 20. And so there's a little bit of cognitive dysfunction going on there too, mate. And so would you, by the way, and so would I, if we were facing 91 total criminal indictments.
Yeah. Anyway, all I can say is don't underestimate him.
I think that would be a sin. Certainly he has a pathway to victory. That's very clear. But I'm just seeing I'm looking at how he's going to go early in the new year, and I just think that's when the wobbles are going to kick in. We'll move on to Israel and Gaza, Jack. Oh, no, look, before we do have small modular nuclear reactors, and I'm not going to have a laugh at your expense here, Jack. I am going to have a bit of a laugh at the opposition who hold small modular nuclear reactors as policy. And this comes about because the only company in the United States making them basically filed for bankruptcy, and one of their proposed SMNRs, small modular nuclear reactors, has now been cancelled because of cost overruns, Jack. And we're now talking about a 6-reactor, 462 megawatt plant was slated to begin construction by 2026. now stopped. And then we start looking at the costs and the delays here and how these SMNRs, one, ramping up the cost of electricity, and two, being unable to provide any substantial infusion into a grid. It's interesting stuff, Jack.
So does that mean that if you're getting projects cancelled, you don't like this process anymore?
No, what I'm saying is, Jack, how can the opposition cling to this as policy when it's falling over? And not just falling over because you've got NewScale, which is the company now in financial trouble and seeking protection from its creditors, but they're actually having to scale back the output of an SMNR and at a higher price. So what we've always talked about with nuclear energy in Australia, is it cheap? Is it reliable? Is it carbon friendly? Zero emissions, if you like. And the answer to the zero emissions is yes, more or less. And the answer to the other things is no, it's not cheap and it's not reliable.
Good. While you're checking these things out, have a look at a Danish company called Ørsted. They've just cancelled the Ocean Wind 1 and 2 offshore wind schemes in the United States at a cost of £3 billion British pounds. And why?
Wales?
No. Global offshore and wind had found itself in a perfect storm of skyrocketing costs caused by high inflation and rising interest rates. The industry woes have also been compounded by problems in the supply chain, and they're not got the reliable enough guarantees on the price they're going to get, which was the problem with the small modular nuclear reactors, the project that you were talking about. They couldn't get a guarantee of a big enough price to justify the investment. So the same problems are happening.
Did you have a look at their megawatt outage?
Yeah. I did.
Because small nuclear reactors now, small modular nuclear reactors, modular just means it's built somewhere else and then fitted where it wants to go. We're basically, look at this, the commitments in place to buy the reactor's future power covered less than 25% of its output. UAMP set itself a year-end deadline to bump that figure to 80% by recruiting new customers, and they just haven't been able to do it, Jack.
Yeah, the same goes with the offshore wind
smaller
project.
Amounts of power, and it's more expensive. It's not the same. It's not the same at all. But basically, what I'm saying to you is that the opposition has an energy plan, right, for Australia that involves SMNRs. That's the only. Basically, that's their energy policy in a nutshell. To basically committing this country to build things that are really just architectural design drawings.
Yeah, and I don't really care what the opposition's policy is because they're not going to be the government. I think a policy on environmental issues, on climate change, if you like, that doesn't include a wide variety of things, including nuclear power, is just nonsense.
Well, we don't do it, Jack, because it fails two. It fails two of the three tests. Not reliable, not cheap.
Well, the renewables fail one of them on every occasion. They're not reliable.
Well, who says they're not reliable? Where have they been unreliable? Where?
Well,
where?
They can't guarantee dispatchable power. That's unreliable.
Who said they can't guarantee? Where did this happen?
When can a renewable energy source guarantee dispatchable power? Do you believe in unicorns or something?
What do you mean dispatchable power? Give us a
that
definition.
Is guaranteed
what you're saying is a contribution to the grid. It's
power.
Absolutely, it's renewable. It's a renewable source, whether it's wind, solar, and what are you saying? That it can't be stored? That it can't be?
That's what I'm saying. Can't be stored in number. It can't be stored in the.
What do you mean?
In the quantities
what are we talking about? 1995 funk now. I mean, obviously you would understand the technological developments are about battery storage and holding power longer in a battery system.
Good luck with that.
What do you mean good luck with it? It's happening now as we speak. I mean, yes, there's going to be while we decarbonise the global economy, Jack. There's going to be a lot of money misspent. But the worst thing you can do is lumber people with long-term contracts for power that's unreliable and power that's not cheap. And that's what nuclear is. I mean, we've just seen it You've got the only company in the world who are providing these things have now gone belly up.
And if we did all of that, as you suggested, it would make not one jot of difference, because the consumption of fossil fuels is going up, not down, worldwide, and there's nothing that we can do in Australia or in the Western world that can change that.
Oh, well, so we've scrapped nuclear on that basis alone. But we've scrapped nuclear firstly, and this is the point that I've been making, because it's not cheap and it's not reliable, Jack. That's why we've just seen it. We've just seen it. New scale filing chapter 8, bankruptcy protection or creditor protection. Yeah, so, mate, come on. You've got to look around and you've got to understand what batteries are doing now that they weren't doing 6 months ago or even 3 months ago. You've got to keep up with this. We've got to keep up with that, mate. All right, over to Israel and Gaza. Who have we got here, Jack? We've got an Israeli writer. Help us out.
He had two things to say which I think are true. Two predictions, he says, about this war that have not played out so far. Everyone said a ground operation into Gaza would greatly increase the casualties on both sides, but the opposite has happened. Since they've stopped bombing, since they've stopped using the planes and missiles, far less innocent Gazans have died from ground forces. The other thing he says, everyone said Israel would ruin its ties with the Arab world, but not a single friendly Arab country has chosen to do so.
That's quite true. The other thing that I would also say, Jack, is that when we were talking about the IDF going into Gaza, that there was a likelihood that they would come up against at least a well-reinforced soldiers in well-reinforced positions and made it very difficult for themselves. But and possibly leading into a quagmire, but none of that's happened either.
You looked at the photos and thought this could be Stalingrad, and it certainly hasn't been. There was two meetings in Riyadh at the weekend, one of the Arab League and one of the OIC, the Organisation of Islamic Countries, and they were meant to be separate. In the end, they were kind of plumped together. And that was because the Saudis were trying to get some kind of agreement amongst, I think it's 70-odd countries in total, and they couldn't. And this is from Al Jazeera. People do understand that the Israelis don't really care about what is happening at this summit between the OIC and the Arab League leaders. When you look at the communique, you get a sense that the Arab and Muslim leaders do not have a mechanism to push a ceasefire and humanitarian corridor. The summit was just for the sake of a semblance of unity in the Arab and Muslim world. It is a watered-down statement. Not all Arab leaders decided to attend the summit because of the huge differences and divisions amongst the key players at the summit. So the idea that Israel is losing support in the Arab world is, I think, a furphy. It is losing support in the wider Islamic world, and I think that's true, and that's reflected in the protests we see around the world, the pro-Palestinian protest. There are vanishingly few Arabs in the crowd. They are Muslims from much further away from Israel than that.
And we might also say that they might be losing support of not Western nations so much, but people in large numbers attending rallies over the weekend. Day rally in London, hugely attended. And of course, since then, Jack, I'll get you to comment on this, Suella Braverman has been removed as the Home Secretary, and her replacement's not been made clear yet, but that was after she made a claim that the police were acting in a biased way. Just leave the specifics out of that, or the specific details around that. How stupid do you have to be as a politician to go kick a copper? Or kick the cops. I mean, it's just dumb.
Yeah, and perhaps she deserved to go. It's all very bad politics from Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister. What he needed to do was to, if he was concerned about Braverman, was to come out and say, without talking to her first, just come out and say, this is the government policy. We uphold the law. We don't deport people because they have unfashionable views. We don't prevent protests from happening because they have protesting something that we don't agree with. But he could also come out and say, we uphold the law. That means we expect the police to enforce the law equally, regardless of what the protest is about. And in fact, I would have gone further and said, and they haven't been doing that well enough.
There's a whole lot of evidence about that. I mean, when you've got Tommy Robinson and his group of thugs,
forget Tommy Robinson.
You're probably going to go a bit harder there, but
forget Tommy Robinson. But there is plenty of evidence that they weren't, and that's been happening for a long time. That they've been enforcing some laws much more stringently than other laws, and they have They've caught themselves up. Not just the British police, but they're the worst at it. They've caught themselves up in the idea that the job of the police is to be community engagers, that they've got to be very kind to people and to all the people who are protesting and get selfies taken with them and wave flags with them and all this sort of stuff. And that's not their job. Their job is to enforce the law. And they've got that wrong. But that's what Sunak should have done. Then Suella Braverman would have been faced with the choice of, okay, do I resign or do I come out and fight back against the Prime Minister? Either way, Sunak wins the situation. He didn't do that. What he did was he ran around sacking people. He's brought David Cameron back into the cabinet.
I know, it's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, he needed to do the work on this because he is a member of the House of Lords.
Well, he had to become a member of the House of Lords.
He had to become one, yes. In fact, Charles
yesterday. He became a member of the House of Lords yesterday so he could take the cabinet spot. The government looks a complete shambles. This is now an election for Keir Starmer to lose.
Yeah, it is really death knell stuff. I agree with that. Braverman, for me, the worst statement she made was that homeless people basically choose to live the lives they lead, and that was just an incredibly callous and stupid statement to people who are genuinely homeless. One commenter came forward to say there are high rates of brain injury for people who are homeless. People have suffered a brain injury and then never quite recovered and found themselves sleeping rough on streets and things like that. I mean, yeah, she really is of that bent that, well, maybe this isn't out for Sunak, that he's got one less extremist on his side. But he's come out of this much, much weaker. And what on earth's David Cameron thinking? For a bloke of his background, you might think, oh, well, he's got a spot in the House of Lords. But frankly, if you're from David Cameron's background, being in the House of Lords is a bit common and a bit naff. Gone from the animals to the vegetables, Jack, and as they say. But
Keir Starmer's doing the right thing. He's obeying the old rules. Never interrupt your opponent when they're in the process of making a mistake.
True
so
enough.
He's kept his head down.
I had to actually. But Phil, how can you make him Secretary of State? And basically their Minister for Foreign Affairs. And I thought, he's still in the Parliament. No, he retired and he resigned in 2016. I couldn't figure it out for a long time. And then I thought, he must be in the Lords. And then I looked at the Lords and he's not there. And so they've created this situation. It looks so bad. It looks terrible. And Cameron's had a series of scandals that he's been involved in post-politics. He's probably the least likely person that you would want to see again. I mean, whether you're for or against Brexit, you'd still be looking at him and going, well, he's the bloke who made this mess.
Yeah, well, I thought the Tories were almost certain to lose
now they're certain,
but they've just...
odds on?
Yeah.
Short odds on?
Yeah.
All right,
you could go round to the payout window and start lining up now.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, poor performance really from a whole host, and it really does look like a government in the UK just not just run out of steam. It looks like they're dead men walking.
It's a shambles.
All right, so there was something very interesting, Jack, that I wanted to... We're sort of running out of time, but we do need to get to this. There was a BBC report this week and or last week that suggested something... Oh, no, it was actually just covered on the weekend. Something unprecedented is happening, says the report, this weekend in Paris, brought about by the war between Israel and Hamas and its spillover in Europe. For the first time ever, a major demonstration being attended by representatives of the major political parties includes the far right, but not the far left. On Sunday afternoon, thousands of people heeded a call from the speakers of the two houses of Parliament to show their support for French Republican values and their rejection of anti-Semitism. This in the face of a steep rise in anti-Semitic action since 7 October. Among the first to announce their presence were Marine Le Pen, three-time presidential candidate for the National Rally, formerly the National Front, and the party's young president, Jordan Bardella. Almost simultaneously came a rejoinder from their counterpart on the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, irascible leader of France Unbowed. His party would not be attending. It's a really interesting thing, Jack, and I think it's a reflection of the global reaction to the Hamas attack and now to the war that is going on between Israel and Hamas. And the left, particularly the far left, has shown its anti-Semitic spots, and the far right not so much.
Well, I don't think the anti-Semitism on the far right has gone away.
No,
and there was always some anti-Semitism on the far left as well.
Yes, true enough.
It's spread, the anti-Semitism has spread from the very far end of the far left through a fair bit of the progressive world now. And that's because they've talked themselves into dividing the world between what they think are the oppressed and the oppressors. And that's their only sort of demarcation line. So that's where the whole Israel is a settler colonialist country comes from.
So this is a comment from that report from Serge Klaasfeld, and he and his wife helped bring Nazi war criminals to justice and documented the deportations and deaths of 80,000 Jews from France exterminated in the Holocaust. Must be said that once France fell, or most of France fell, to the Nazis, their record on Jewish persecution and looking the other way is not very good. Much better. The Italians much better.
This is Vichy France you're talking about.
Well, Vichy France, of course, but there were many Parisian Jews were rounded up and placed in a velodrome in Paris. And they remained there for a couple of weeks before transportation to camps was ultimately arranged. And no one seemed to give a damn about it, Jack. I would say the Italians, who are actually on the Axis side of things, have a better story to tell in terms of resisting Nazi orders to persecute and transport Jews from their country. Hungarians also too, until very late in the war. And France doesn't have it must be said, does not have a great history in this. But anyway, this is Serge Klaasfeld and his wife who helped bring Nazi war criminals to justice, and he told Le Figaro, he's an 88-year-old man, for me, the DNA of the far right is anti-Semitism. So when I see a big party of the far right abandon anti-Semitism and negationism and move towards their Republican values, naturally I rejoice. He goes on to say, the far left, for its part, has always had its own anti-Semitic tradition, just as you said, Jack. So just as I am relieved to see the RN take a stand for Jews, so I am sad to see the far left abandon its actions to combat anti-Semitism. It's a fair comment, isn't it?
It is. Just one thing about all the demonstrations that are happening around the world. I don't know what you think, but I'm not convinced. I'm convinced there's wide support, particularly on the progressive left, for the Palestinians, but I don't believe that's anything like majority support. I think it's a noisy minority.
I think we can talk about resolving the issue of dispossession around Palestine or Palestinians. The simple fact of the matter is that Palestinians have been offered a homeland, I think, on seven occasions since 1937. And it's really not come to anything. And that's, I think you used the term, and I've used it too, that the Palestinians are largely the architects of their own misfortune in many ways. They've allowed themselves in this instance to be overwhelmed by a twisted ideology in Hamas. I don't know where we go with this. I understand there are some people around who would say that the creation of a Jewish state of Israel post-World War II was perhaps not the best way to approach things, because it would always create a deep anger and resentment from Arab nations in the region. But I don't know where we go from here in terms of a Palestinian homeland. And that seems to be the rallying cry of the left at the moment. Would that be right?
That's a bit unclear. A lot of the progressive left say we want a two-state solution, but I can tell you who doesn't want a two-state solution is Hamas, a good deal of the Palestinian Authority, Iran, Syria, etc. But none of them want a two-state solution. They want Israel gone.
That's right. Yeah. From the river to the sea, as they say.
Yep.
I mean, there are, and I won't ask you the trivia on this, but we know that there are a number of countries that are driven by religion, Islamic countries. There are a number of Christian countries like this. There are a number of secular countries, but there's only one Jewish country in the world. So when you talk about or sing or indeed from the river to the sea, what you are actually saying is the obliteration of the Israeli state.
You are. This has all proven very difficult for progressive Jews around the world, and they are having their world turned upside down because the people who they thought were friends, they thought were allies, who they thought shared values with, are now, if they're not pro-Hamas, they're pretty damn close to it.
Yeah.
What do you do if you sit at the next desk to somebody and you thought you shared values? You both do a job that is a very progressive job, and you know that your colleague is going out on the streets on the weekend and chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. How do you reconcile that relationship?
I don't know. I have no answer to that.
No, nor do I. And this is the problem that a lot of progressive Jews around the world are wrestling with as we speak. How do I move forward from this when people who I thought were my allies are calling for the obliteration of the only Jewish country in the world?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, Jack, in Germany, the Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, has implemented a formal ban on any groups that show support for Hamas, including protesters. In a statement, she said, "With Hamas, I have today completely banned the activities of a terrorist organisation whose aim is to destroy the state of Israel." So,
I've got to say, the Germans have been very strong about all of this, much more so than other countries in Europe.
the Hamas flag is banned in Germany. Oh, I just wonder if I think these things are largely symbolic, but if we started talking about banning flags, as we did with the Islamic State flag in Australia, can you imagine the outrage? There would have been this sort of, where's my freedom of speech outrage, that sort of nonsense.
I don't think banning stuff like this is the right approach.
It's not terribly helpful, but I'm just asking you to imagine the backlash.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't think. I think that's the wrong approach. In the same way as what I suggested, Rishi Sunak should say is, no, we allow protests for all. You're allowed to be stupid. We allow protests for silly ideas.
But you're allowed to assemble. You have a right to assemble.
But we've got laws that we can enforce. If you're chanting "gas the Jews," expect to be arrested.
What are you going to be charged with, though, Jack? Offensive behaviour. These things. This is part of the problem, and that sort of chant. And to be fair, those, with a few exceptions, the rallies in Australia have been, thankfully, the pro-Palestinian rallies, thankfully, have been devoid of that kind of nonsense for the most part. But there have been some ugly scenes at the same time. Very bad in Caulfield last week, and it really is an unpleasant time. I've been thinking about doing a column, which I'll be writing tomorrow, that it really needs to explore. I think people's understanding of the history of anti-Semitism, particularly in Germany in the 1930s, which led to the final solution in the 1940s, is that these things were incremental. They didn't start with putting Jewish people on trains and sending them to concentration camps. It didn't start that way at all. It started by increment and largely had the support of the German people. And that's the concern. It always is concerned with anti-Semitism, whether it comes from the left or comes from the right. It is never far away. All right, moving on to sport.
World Cup cricket semi-finals start tomorrow.
Yeah, as we record this tomorrow, India will play New Zealand. They're playing in Mumbai, and Australia will play the South Africans in Gardens. Just to get there, a marvellous innings from Mitch Marsh, 177, his highest score for Australia, I think, overall. in all forms. And he continues to hit the ball very hard. And also Adam Zampa, he probably started the tournament a little bit slowly, but he's now the leading wicket taker in that. India come into the finals undefeated. New Zealand have had some injuries. They've had some form issues that allowed them to just make the four. So you'd expect India to knock New Zealand over in Mumbai. And I expect Australia to beat South Africa in Calcutta as well. But you might have a different opinion, Jack.
Look, it's knockout stages of tournaments, always a bit tricky. But yeah, India are hot favourites to beat New Zealand and favourites to win the whole thing. Australia probably looks a bit more likely than South Africa, but whoever's going to beat India is going to have to hope they get the Indians on a slightly bad day, I think.
Yeah, that's basically it. As a commentator, new to the commentary box, Shane Watson has been saying there are no weaknesses in that Indian side.
No.
Brilliant bowling.
Yeah, sport's sport, and you're in a winner-takes-all competition. Someone's got to be a loser. Things can go wrong.
Yeah, there you go. So the Aussies are up, I think, Friday, isn't it, Jack? The second semi in
Wednesday and
Kolkata.
Thursday, I think, and the finals on Sunday.
Oh, that's it. Yes, they're only a day apart, and then the final on the Sunday. Sorry about that, folks. I owe you a slab, Jack. I've left the phone on while we're recording, so that's in the mail. And we also have the AFLW finals coming as well, Jack.
Yeah, and I lost my little piece of paper with the details on it. All I can say is it's going really very well because they're pitching it at just the right level. They're using the right kind of grounds, and they're maintaining a healthy degree of interest.
All right, and big crowds at the races, Jack. Saying up to the Cup, getting a bit of a high.
So they were up percent, I think, from last year, the numbers, and the crowds, and the weather was probably good, that helps, but their figures for viewership on the net and on the television were very good as well. So I think the people who think that racing's on its way out and dying, they're not on the money.
Yeah, welcome, the VRC welcomed a total of 262,165 racegoers across the 4 race days. So that's the Derby, the Melbourne Cup, the Oaks. What else have we got? Oh, we haven't had it yet.
Champions Day was on Saturday, so that was a pretty good day.
262,000. No, you wouldn't have to go back far to find much better attendances than that. I mean, there used to be the Derby. They'd get about 140 at the Derby sometimes.
Back in the day when I used to go to all 4 days, the Oaks Day was only about 30,000 in those days. So these are good numbers.
Yeah, encouraging for the horses. Just leave them out of Kosciuszko if you don't mind. If they're not running all that well, find a home for them. Find a good home for them. Don't just dump them in the Alpine territories of New South Wales, because that is a big problem, as we kicked off the show with. Well, thank you, Jack, for your time, and particularly around those immigration issues, which you provide a great deal of clarity on. And we just want to remind our listeners today that you can get hold of us with comments, criticisms, etc., and get hold of me by hitting me up on, a number of people hit me up on Facebook too, but you're more than welcome to hit me up on Twitter at Jack the Insider. My DMs are always open, and you can get hold of Jack too on his Substack. Give me the address there, please, mate.
HongKongJack.substack.com. Just before we go, just something from David Burge, my favourite person on Twitter. Everybody wants to march in Magdalene Princess style candlelit vigils with "Je suis Charlie" signs, but nobody wants to be Charlie Hebdo.
Well, that's fair enough. Yeah, well, we want a sense of belonging. Charlie Hebdo, I mean, I used to read a lot of National Lampoons, Jack, but I reckon even PJ O'Rourke would have considered some of Charlie's work pretty out there.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I thought it was a completely rubbish magazine, but that's not a justification for going in with a gun and shooting people.
Exactly right. All right. Thank you for your time today, and thank you, listeners, and we will be back to you next week. See ya.